this so we can share it with others tomorrow. But Leeann Younger, welcome into the space. I'm so excited to have you.
Hi, friend.
Yes, Leeann and her husband Wayne and their family are just some of our oldest and dearest friends. They're soul friends. We've journeyed through a lot of life together, and I'm really excited to introduce you to everyone here, just so that they can get to know a little bit of you, and that you can put some of your goodness out into this space. But Leeann is not only a friend, she's a mother, she's a lifelong partner to her husband Wayne. She's pastor, co-founder of her church, City View. She's a writer. She's a community advocate. She was sitting at the polls all day yesterday. And today in Pittsburgh, we are celebrating the election of Mayor-elect Ed Gainey, who is our first African-American mayor here in Pittsburgh, and excited about him and excited about that. Leeann is a follower of Jesus and currently a student. She loves being a student. And she is studying a Master of Theological Studies with an emphasis on decolonizing church practices, which I bet a lot of people didn't know was a thing that you could get a master's in.
Well, I'm just making it happen.
That's awesome. But Leeann, before we get into kind of like some of the things we want to discuss tonight, just would you tell us a little bit more about who you are and your family, and a little bit about your church, City View, here in Pittsburgh?
Sure. I suppose I would say I'm the mother of three young adults. One is actually a teen. So I'm feeling that age thing that comes when your little ones are big now. They were, I don't know, 6, 8, and 9 or something when we planted our church. My husband and I felt called, really, and I tend not to speak that way, but we really felt this pull to leave a rather large church in our neighborhood. Metaphorically, I'd say this is the metaphor. Our actual offices were on the 5th floor, and we felt like God was saying, get to the street. And so we sort of milled around trying to figure out what it is we were supposed to do. Thought it might be a nonprofit. We weren't quite sure. Landed on a real certainty that we were called to plant a church. And our first reaction was, oh no, not a church. The world doesn't need any more churches. And so we don't want to do that. But we felt really like this was the path that God was laying before us. And so 12 years ago, we started our fellowship. And in those 12 years, all kinds of things happened. I like to tell people the first 5 years of church planting were, it's like you're building a boat and you invite all your friends in to help you build the boat. And then you spend those first 5 years just trying not to sink. Like just constantly bailing water off the boat.
Just the first 5? Just the first 5?
Well, it's kind of like year 5, 6, we started thinking, oh, we could maybe have a 3-year plan. And so we felt like we could actually do that. And over that time, probably the biggest things that have happened in the 12 years is that the neighborhood has rapidly gentrified. So where in those first 5 years, I would have said we were kind of 50-50 in terms of the socioeconomic division, 70-30 in terms of race. We are a predominantly white church because of the neighborhood that we're in. It was a neighborhood where houses were selling, gutted houses could be bought for like $5,000 or $6,000. Now you couldn't buy a gutted house for less than $50,000. A number of our congregation members who were renting, lost their homes, had to move out of the neighborhood. There's a whole story about under-resourced folks being pushed out of the city, especially Black folks. And so we look a lot different than we did when we started. And my husband and I had a sort of come to Jesus moment where we had to decide, is this still where we were supposed to be? And we really felt like we were, that our job shifted maybe from getting folks who were in the congregation to turn their hearts towards each other, to taking this mostly middle-class group of people and really challenging them to live more fully into justice in the neighborhoods that they were in this rapidly gentrifying city. So
Yeah.
that's where we are.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about where you meet, or
Yeah.
the space that you're in.
We own we're buying a community center, which we run as a community center. So our first couple of years we met in an actual church building, but then got sort of caught up with some folks who wanted, the folks who owned it really thought the stained glass windows were worth 3 times the appraisal, and yada, yada, yada. We landed in this community center, which turned out to be the best thing that could have ever happened to us. So it doesn't look like a church, if you will, but it had a kitchen, and it just sort of led us into feeding people regularly. We run the building as a community center. So on weekends, there are birthday parties. Seniors come and play bingo twice a week. We have a women's drop-in center there. And so it's the community space, and we are the church that meets in the community center.
And now you kind of you brushed by it a little bit, kind of in the quick snapshot of the transition. Like, I would love for you to speak just a little bit more about, like, you started in this poor, low income neighborhood, where you were attracting a variety of people: Black, white, poor, middle class. And then in the gentrification process, you found yourself now pastoring a mostly white congregation.
Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit more about that journey for you?
Sure. That was hard. On a really personal level, I am a product of the Black church. And so I like it when people say amen when I'm preaching. I like it when people clap on the 2 and the 4. Okay. And so a lot of that changed. But then also, I think maybe the biggest struggle was, what is mission? We felt called to that neighborhood because of its economic struggles. And then what's interesting is that in a church in our context, what you end up attracting are the people who come because they like that vibe. The middle class people come because they like being in the mix, but they don't realize that they're actually part of taking up some of the space from the folks who were there before them, or that people like them are buying up the houses that are pushing out the people they felt really called to be with in worship. So it was a real shift. I think it changed our worship, our gatherings. Worship isn't a whole life thing, right? So, but I think it changed our gatherings, because I would say it this way: I think our middle class folks were really confronted with truth, with the truth of the mask of their identity, when they're sitting and worshiping with folks who weren't sure they had enough food to feed their kids the next day, or were clearly struggling with addiction, but still coming to this community to be a part of a fellowship of Jesus followers. And so for the folks who'd learned to sort of practice putting on their church clothes, both physically and metaphorically, this congregation then really stripped that away. And so now it's a bit of a challenge. It's more of a challenge to keep putting that challenge in front of middle class folks. I think, some of and we're going to talk about decolonization, some of my own process of decolonization meant speaking more boldly about economic and social justice realities. And so the folks who really did want to just come and put their church clothes on started leaving. That's part of the transition too, is that sort of to stay authentic to who we were called to be. I think that I just had to be very unapologetic about who I was and what God was calling us to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I want to, Deborah asked a good question here, if you can see in the chat. Doesn't that cost you a lot as a Black woman having to continue to push white people?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I have sort of two sides of that answer. One is, oh yeah. But the other is a bit of, well, I'll say it cost a lot more when I was still sort of trying to work hard at making the gospel palatable for the white folks in the room, because I thought that was my job, was to make sure I found a way to say the truth of Jesus in a way that didn't upset white folks or anybody, white folks especially, middle-class folks especially. But the other side of it is, well, I just decided not to pay that cost anymore. And so now, honestly, I say what I need to say, what I feel God has called me to say. And if you want to be a part of this congregation, you're going to hear those things. I don't beg or push anybody anymore. I just tell the truth, and then people move or they don't move. So I don't know. My personal pastor, Jeff Eddings, would call that spiritual indifference, and I think I feel pretty healthily detached from the end result. I will say one other thing. I believe in the vision of the beloved kingdom, and that is a vision that includes all of us. And so some of us who have are marginalized folks in majority spaces, some of us stay because we feel like this is part of the call to continue to build bridges to a multi-ethnic, multi-socioeconomic community, but not a multi-ethnic community that really just is Black folks accommodating whiteness. It's really a place where everyone is authentically who they were created to be.
And Leeann, I just want to affirm, like, I'm so grateful you stay, because there's a lot of times, in our journey together and the stories that I know of your life where you would have every reason to just believe and to not necessarily be in the space that you continue to faithfully inhabit. And so I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful that you're the one person in this series that's currently like pastoring, because you can help give us this perspective. Like, you've just talked about like all the just the regular challenges of starting a church and starting in a kind of a poor community that's being gentrified, and the struggles with white privilege and racism. It's all mixed up into the work that you're doing. But now on top of that, we have placed COVID, right? And we have placed the world kind of being on fire. And we have placed racism and white privilege and white supremacy as being heightened. And the reason why I wanted to have these conversations is to acknowledge, one, that our pastors are stressed out and are weary and are tired. And two, they don't know how to care for themselves well. And so just wondering, asking you personally, before we get deeper into the like kind of decolonization piece, what is your experience of the COVID space in, and how have you been handling that the extra anxiety and stress, and how are you caring for yourself?
Yeah, wow. I thought you weren't going to ask me how I cared for myself. That was our agreement.
That was never the agreement.
Well, so I will say we stopped meeting March 2020, right? We stopped meeting in person. We met on Zoom. And, lots of folks have these experiences, whether you went to Zoom or you stopped meeting or you started meeting outside. The effect of it was initially, because everything slowed down, I actually became more aware of my own anxiety about performance, about just sort of physically not having to rush everywhere. I found that I was still rushing internally. So
yeah.
I think that was the beginning of me leaning more into meditation as a way of addressing what I felt like was a real sign that I was not settled in my soul. I was running around planting the church, so in some ways I was never settled in my soul, but you put that hard stop in, and immediately, you stop doing something, and immediately all the things, all the emotions you're avoiding come up, right? And so so that was part of it. I think too, I was just having this conversation with a congregant today, that it's been about 18 months. We finally had our first service inside. We spent from Easter up until like 2 weeks ago meeting outside. But one of the things that happened in our context, because we've always been short-staffed and slightly underfunded, right? Is that all of our systems sort of collapsed, right? So the things that were just part of our Sunday weekly rhythm of getting together, of, serving Thursday meals, of just whatever there were volunteers around to do, all of that kind of got full stop. And so I feel like I'm just coming out of having ended up carrying a lot more things than I ever intended to carry. I also think that part of my reflection about this is that I ended up carrying a lot of things in part because I didn't say, hey, I don't want to carry this. I need help. It's been a little bit of a revelation to me that at first I was kind of frustrated. At first it was just kind of emergency mode, like just do this, keep things going, keep the congregation together, do what needs to be done. But then it sort of became a rhythm, or maybe even an addiction, if you will. And now as I'm kind of processing that, as we try to reestablish some systems, I'm realizing, I didn't really throw my hand up and say, I can't keep doing it this way. So there's a lesson there for me. That's probably been the lesson of church planting for the last 12 years, to be honest. And maybe my husband would say that's kind of the lesson of life for Leeann. Like, she just carries more than she should. So
as long as you keep learning it, keep pressing into it.
That's right.
Hold on to it. Like as churches are emerging, a lot of the anxiety I'm hearing from pastors is their community wants to get back to what was.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that's the best thing to get back to.
Nope.
So for City View, what are you looking to get back to, and what are you maybe letting go of, or what are you hoping to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. And within the first 3 months of the hardest part of the pandemic, the early part, I made it really clear that we were moving forward, because it was really clear to me that whatever we were doing before, all of us as humanity, as Americans, was not working. I had a congregant who's a doctor tell me about a guy who showed up at his office making threats because he wanted to get arrested, because he thought if he could get arrested during the pandemic, he'd have a place to sleep and a place to eat. All the places where he normally would eat or even, find water, things were just shutting down and closing off access. And so I felt like that was such a symbolic, that story for me. Just I shared it with the congregation as a way of saying, like, we need to not think about going back, like, because back was still wrong. And so I would say one of the things that happened to us this summer, we started meeting at Easter outside, and that was just sort of a thing we were doing to accommodate COVID. But at some point this summer, the things that you do to make an outside service work, which are kind of strip everything down, kind of get rid of some of the trappings of tradition, like they became the ethos that was really growing life in our church. Enough that we had people visit us because we were meeting outside, and who sort of decided this was the place they wanted to be. We had one woman just driving by who saw our worship leader outside on his guitar, pulled up, and 6 months later, she's still with us, or 4 months later, she's awesome. Still, yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to get to is basically to keep this sort of intimate ethos as we move back inside, where folks want me to get to kind of setting up chairs and rows and doing the PowerPoint and all the things, right, that felt comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but I feel really convicted that the essence of what we discovered when the things that were normal to us were taken away, that essence is something we should keep. And and I've got a lot of folks who are coming along on that.
That's good. That's a good word. I really feel, especially that whole reflection on just being outside and someone driving up and getting connected, and like, what happens when the church gets outside the walls? Hey,
right. Exactly.
Crazy things. People get mad. Molly, could you put the definition, my own personal definition of the way of spiritual fortitude, in the chat? Because I do want to talk about this idea of decolonization as a way of even developing our spiritual fortitude. So once again, my definition is the way of spiritual fortitude is developing the mental, emotional, and spiritual strength to bear pain, encounter adversity or temptation with courage, by nurturing resilient spiritual practices where we learn to love ourselves that we may then love and care for others. And in our conversations, Leeann, we've talked about the idea of this decolonizing our spiritual practice as a way of building some fortitude for us. And I'm curious, let's put this in the chat, Molly, when you hear the word decolonization, friends, what do you think of? Just when you hear decolonization, what comes to mind? Either a word or a phrase, and just put it in there. Because it's kind of a buzzword right now, right, Leeann? Like the last few years, it's become a buzzword. And I wonder if do we want to start by can you tell us a little bit about your master of theological studies? How did you end up there? How did that end up being a thing? Is that a place we can start?
Yeah, sure. I believe it or not, I know Facebook has done a lot of evil things, but they sent me an ad that sent me to school. So I'm actually a student at PSR, Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. They had an online program that was focused on spirituality and social change. And those two things, at the moment that I saw them, which is post George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and everything, just really captured my heart. And so I started there doing a lot of kind of social justice and theology classes, and eventually kind of fell in love with this question of who was Jesus outside of the hands of colonizers? And what does that mean for the church? So I actually shifted my, from kind of this certificate degree to an MTS. I don't know if I'll go beyond that or not, but I'm spending this semester studying culturally indigenous aspects of theology in India, Africa, and then a global theology class that has a lot of different cultures represented.
Yeah, and how is that? Well, before I ask that question, do you remember like the first time you heard the word like decolonization?
Yeah,
and like your encounter with it and what you thought of it. And,
yeah, that's a good question. The word I heard was colonized. The word I heard was colonized mind, as it referred specifically to Black folks, and as it referred specifically to me. That's sort of where the door opened. So decolonization really came out of an acknowledgement of how much my own thinking, because of the context where I grew up, and I think it's important for your folks to know, I grew up in a housing project, but it was in the suburbs. And so I was granted a fair amount of educational privilege because I grew up in a family that emphasized speaking English a certain way, that emphasized, I was going to college from the minute I was born. I didn't know that, but I know it now when I look at my family story. And in that context, I was taught to think that I got where I got to because I earned my way there, not because certain people granted privileges to me. Not that and I'm not saying I didn't have talent or whatever. What I'm saying is somebody who presented themselves differently couldn't get the same opportunities I got. I know that now. I didn't know it then. The reason that's important is because that's the colonized mind. The colonized mind sort of leans into hierarchy, leans into this idea that that power is earned. Power and privilege are all earned and deserved. And if you don't have it, it's not because somebody didn't give it to you. It's that you don't have it because you weren't good enough to get it. Understanding the colonized mind led me on this journey of decolonization for myself.
Yeah, and I love that phrase, the colonized mind. I mean, because that just really, I don't know, it makes it real for me for some reason. Like decolonization feels like out here, like when I think about how has my mind been influenced or colonized in certain ways that impact how I see the world, and what then do I need to do to begin that process of that decolonization?
And I would say, and maybe we can talk more about this later. I'm not quite sure where you want to bring this up, but something I have been growing and understanding of since we talked about me having this conversation with you is the invitation. So as a person with a marginalized identity, Black woman, decolonizing is part of the work that I do, which is agitating to dismantle supremacy, right? But those of you and on the call that are heirs to the privileges that come inherently in whiteness, the call is actually to act in anti-colonial ways. In other words, the call is to resist the ways in which your privilege allows you to take advantage of systems that other people can't take advantage of.
Yeah. And so how has your studies, like this current studies, as you're like kind of, sounds like what you've been studying around indigenous people being colonized in different contexts, how has that expanded your own understanding of the whole idea of decolonization?
Yeah, I think fundamentally I have come to understand colonization. So I want to share like a visual image if I could, right?
Yeah.
The Wizard of Oz, a lot of people know the Wizard of Oz, right? Now I know more about the Wiz, I got to be honest, right? But there's a moment in the Wizard of Oz where a house falls on, I think it's the Good Witch, right? It falls on a witch, right? And you have that image of like the house and the feet sticking out, right? Colonization is literally like someone coming and just dropping a house on top of yours and saying, you can still live here, but you have to live in my house. But underneath the house is everything that's yours, or your ways of knowing God, your family rituals, whatever is precious to you is buried underneath the house that got dropped on top of you. So when I think about how the impact of colonization, and what I've been studying is ultimately the erasure of primarily indigenous cultures. So essentially, the work of colonization is really this growing entity centered in whiteness and Anglo-Saxon supremacy that rejects the value of cultures and people and bodies that God has made.
And so what does it mean, do you think, for us to decolonize our spiritual practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard, but I think part of the question is, what is the impact of colonization? And then how do you undo that? Right? So the impact of colonization in my life as a Black woman is to quiet my voice, right? Is to silence my voice. And so part of my practice is to grow in comfort in my own skin, and to speak what it is that the Spirit has given me to speak. I think for folks who live in white bodies, that part of the question for you is, what has colonization, what voices have been silenced? And what are you doing to listen to them? So I really would say that decolonized spiritual practice is an intentional effort to pick up, listen to, follow, engage in relationship with the folks who got crushed under the house. That's making the intention to do that is the beginning of a process for all of us.
And am I just reaching here when I'm trying to say, and this will build our spiritual fortitude?
I
would say a real connection?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was looking at your definition, and I've looked at it 100 times. So now I'm like, oh, I never told him this, but I just thought this today, right?
Yeah.
Bearing pain, right? Bearing pain. I would almost change that word to befriend, but to understand
pain.
Yeah, to understand, to embrace, because that image of bearing, right? That's really a colonizer spirit, right? Coming in with standing against whatever's trying to stand against you, that's kind of, for me, that's what it stirred up. And I think part of this spiritual practice, especially around decolonization, I think if we look at Indigenous cultures, if we look at some of the writers out there, if we look at an Indigenous worldview where the earth is alive with the presence of God, right? Then the goal is just to be, to exist, to live in harmony with other humans, to live in harmony with nature. And the storms are going to come. And just like you said, Jeff, like we're going to be mountains in the storm, but we do it in a communal sense. And so at times, I think some of these cultures that we've silenced have better, I won't say better, have more, have given more priority to the rituals that help us befriend our pain, feel our grief, connect at the deepest levels to other humans and to the earth.
Are there certain of those rituals that you found helpful, Leeann?
Yeah, so I will say that I'm really into mindfulness right now, just because it's about stopping and connecting to your body. The thing, I thought about this question because I knew you were going to ask it, and I'll say this. So I was in a class led by an Indigenous friend, and I was like, hey, so I've been reading about Latin American spirituality, and I love it. And is it okay if I pray this prayer wheel from, native, Indigenous Latin folks? And she said, well, the truth is these are all done in relationship. These are all done, ceremony is done in relationship with the earth, in relationship with God, in relationship and community. And so she told me the story about a guy who wanted her husband to teach him how to, and these were Native Indigenous Americans, to sweat, right? And and the guy shows up with all these papers because he printed it out on the internet, and now he knows how to do it. Right. So there's that's the issue.
Google will tell you.
That's the issue, right? Decolonization has become a buzzword because we're a culture of technique, and so I would say even our individual spiritual formation can be approached from a culture of technique. And that kind of counters the entire goal of what you're trying to lead people to, which is a space where we can endure what's coming, but we don't endure it because we bolstered ourselves and we're super strong now. We, in some ways, we endure it because we have embraced it. We've befriended it. It's accompanying us, and we accompany each other on this road together.
Thanks. I find that really helpful. And I really like that pivot from bear to befriend, and how that's like our call to each other is befriending one another in our pain. Susan here in the chat is asking any suggestions on how to connect and lift up people under the house. Does this entail more than living communally? And I think just what you were speaking to kind of speaks to that question a bit. It is about the relationship. It's about accompanying. It's about befriending others in their pain. Maybe more than like figuring out how to, I don't know. We tend to want to fix it, right? And I'm a fixer person. Like I want to fix it. How do I make it better? And this is such a difficult thing. There's no fixing it, but how do we become more present to what's happening, to others, and come alongside them in what's happening to them, not in the fix it manner, right?
Exactly. I saw that question come up, and I thought, I don't want to offend Susan, but it, part of what that is a very Western mindset. How can I fix it? What can I change? What do I have to do to make this happen? And part of that's because most of us are living too fast and too hard and so busy, and especially as pastors, right? We can't figure out where to take the time to do these things, to establish these relationships. But the truth is, befriending our pain, befriending others in their pain takes time. Takes time before the pain arrives, takes time in celebration, time in coming alongside of folks. So I would say the voices that were silenced are voices folks seeking to lean into decolonization need to listen to. Not really, they're speaking. Like we don't need to raise them up, right? They're speaking. They're telling us exactly what needs to be done. I mean, I think a good example is California. Certain places in California are doing controlled burns to help with the whole like fire thing. And that's actually an indigenous technique that could have been listened to a long time ago, right? And so I think finding, whether it's authors, depending on where folks live, finding communities near you, it's not really what you do, it's what you like, get permission to come and accompany folks and stay longer than you want to. That's
a good, I like that. Yes. Cause I'm reflecting on what Deborah put in here, which is true. Like it's more than befriending the people we've just dropped the house on, like, hey friend, and thoughts and prayers, which like anytime my kids hear anybody say like thoughts and prayers, like the eyes roll, but like there's a little, they just can't stand it. They're always like, Christians and their thoughts and prayers. But the staying to the place where it's where there's sacrifice involved, which I believe kind of what Therese was also talking about last week. The space of like contemplation and befriending that cost us something, and that calls us to something. So can we talk about Jesus? I like to talk about Jesus.
Yeah, I kind of think we should.
You asked earlier, who is Jesus outside hands of the colonizers? Like that was one of your driving questions. Have you come to an answer?
How Western of you. Actually, I'll tell you the thing I coming to you, right? And it's that enculturating Jesus outside of the call. So here's what we have to understand. Mm-hmm. Missionaries showed up with a gospel message that said, we're here to tell you about Jesus, and Jesus doesn't love anything about you except for you doing the things that I tell you to do, right? So and that message, right, is what has to be undone. And so first and foremost, Jesus is somebody who loves what God has created. Like, there are cultures we don't understand, cultures in many ways we don't appreciate. And Jesus loves those folks, but something that those of us, and I say we because I'm an heir to Western tradition like everybody else on this call, right? That something we have to understand is that the message of the gospel was a message that in many cultures produced self-hate. And so I'm reading and working and being taught by theologians who are in the trenches trying to undo that self-hatred, that sense of what it means to, be true Kenyan, and the idea that the gospel message from the missionaries was that God didn't like your drums, and God didn't like your blackness, and God, we can't even use your word for God in the Bible because that might pollute it with savage language, right? And so what I guess right now, I'm just learning to, understand the multiple ways that Jesus has been weaponized, and then learning what it means for these folks to stand in their culture and say, no, this is who Jesus is to us, right? Jesus is our healer from the devastation of colonization. Jesus is, I'll tell you the funniest thing, if we have a second. One of the cultures, and it's not funny, I shouldn't say funny, right? Because this is somebody's culture, but to a Western mind, it's like an odd thing. We talk about Jesus as the Lamb of God, and there are people in certain countries and cultures where they don't have lambs. So they don't have any idea what we're talking about, right? So a truly enculturated message of the gospel in one country that I've been studying is literally Jesus is the rooster, because everybody has roosters. Everybody knows what it means to, to sacrifice that is so valuable, and to feeding your family, and just totally blew my mind, right? And so I guess maybe what the answer to the question of who is Jesus outside of the hands of the colonizers, for me right now, is I'm just learning how much he's been colonized. I'm learning how damaging and devastating the message has been, but I'm also understanding that is not just something that happened in Africa, right? That's something that happens here all the time. It's not just something that happened when at first contact. It is continuing to happen when we go forward with a gospel that says Jesus loves everything about you that I love and hates everything about you that I hate.
Yeah. So can we see Jesus as a decolonizer, like in his time, in the context of the gospel story?
Yeah, I would say it's always dangerous to try to look back and apply a definition that doesn't fit the context. But in this case, my question about that, not question, my response would be, we need to look at Jesus and how did he use his power, or actually how did he resist abuse of power, right? And so, like, if I look at the story at the woman at the well, right, there's a lot that we can't see about it, because in a lot of ways we read it in a very Western way that demeans women and really looks down on this woman. So our shorthand, the short version of the story is Jesus met this really bad woman who talked to him, and ultimately she was so bad, but what he said to her made her like be an evangelist, right? But we never, like, anybody who's preached that sermon knows, like, oh, she's out at noon because she's ashamed of herself and all this stuff. We never say things like, she's out at noon because she's determined to get water for her family, right? We never say she's had 5 husbands and we don't know what that means. Was she kicked out? Did they die? We have no idea. All that says to us in most of our Western lenses is that she was bad. In fact, I had somebody in my congregation say that. Well, she had a bad life, but Jesus loved her. And what as it relates to colonization or the use of structural power, right? Jesus resisted damning her, right? Jesus talked to her. He didn't have to. He could have gone right along. This is what I was saying about anti-colonialism earlier. For those of you who want to figure out what decolonization looks like, there was a script. She was not supposed to talk to him. He certainly was not supposed to give her any honor or any time, but he resisted that and engaged her. And because of that, a whole village was saved. And so that's an example. I think there are lots of other places where we could see that there's, and I'm not saying that Jesus wasn't a product of his culture. I'm just saying there are places where you can see him resisting a cultural script.
Yeah, and the importance of that resistance.
Yeah,
is what you're saying. And
yeah,
we talking about weaponizing Jesus, talking about the way the gospel has been utilized. Man, I'm feeling a little bit heavy because I feel like what do we do about that? It feels like I feel a need, a call to repentance. I feel like I'm trying to examine my life where I've done that. And it feels like there's some important part of that work around our own repentance in that space.
I think a mindful acknowledgement that colonization is part of the air that we breathe, honestly, that the mindset is an inheritance that we are not really aware of. Listen, I am a Black woman, but I'm a church planter. You don't really get more colonizing than being a church planter, especially if you reduce it down to technique and people tell you exactly what to do to make sure that you get as many people as you can, right? And so being mindful
that's my whole job, Leeann, by the way. So yeah.
I'm not saying church planting is wrong. I'm saying the way it's done.
I know.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah.
But I think it's, repentance, lament, it's a posture. It's not a moment. It's not an event. If you need an event, you can, there's ceremony, right? Like in indigenous cultures, in our Western traditions, there are prayers that we can pray. But fundamentally, the prayer is just a statement of intent and orientation, right? And so orienting ourselves to recognizing the embedded nature of structural power that silences, that crushes certain people, that puts us in hierarchy. But not just, I want to say this because I would be remiss if I didn't say it. It's not just humans that are put in hierarchy, right? It's the earth itself. One of the key, one of many aspects of colonization is that the earth became fundamentally just a resource to be exploited, and not as some indigenous folks I know say, not our relative, right? Not one of our relations, and that we're called to live in harmony with, in a relationship of mutual care with. And so I think a posture, repentance is truly a posture of acknowledging that. Not getting it perfect, but at least living with an intent to move in a certain direction.
I think there's a good question here from a little bit back in our conversation. But Carlos, this seems like this is a good time to maybe ask it or put it forward. Carlos asked, what's the opportunity /responsibility /ability of the colonized moving forward?
That's a good question. I think for me, I'll say it this way: as somebody who became aware of my own colonization, it was to seek out places where I could learn a new way of thinking and a new way of being. But the truth is, there's a certain blindness for all of us. We're all trapped, right? Oppressors, the descendants of the colonizers, descendants of the colonized. I think those of us who see, who've been, by God's mercy, granted eyes to see and ears to hear, part of our responsibility is speaking up, inviting others on this journey. But yeah, I would say that. I'm always very careful to not, I don't want to say, oh, well, if they choose to remain colonized, you can just colonize them, right? That's not it. But I think it's all of us knowing our history. This is, we're having all these CRT, fake CRT. I want you to know the argument out there about critical race theory isn't about real critical race theory. But the refusal to talk about the true history of our country is resisting a posture of repentance. And that goes on, that's on both sides, right? So for somebody like me, who is a descendant of the enslaved, who I learned to think of folks who looked like me but couldn't get as much social mobility as I could, as folks who just didn't do it right. And that's poison. That's poison. And so I have to, my posture of repentance is being aware of that poison and being aware of when it creeps up, because it creeps up.
Well, at the risk of pressing into the Western mind, but also wanting to find some handholds for like practices around our own decolonization. Like what I've heard, and feel free to add into this, is of course ways, some ways we can incorporate decolonization into our own space and life is, of course, educate ourselves, learn, listen, come alongside others.
Specifically learn your history, not just of the country, but of your denomination, the actual church that you are a part of, the land that your church is on. Like my church is, here in Pittsburgh, but it's in a neighborhood that used to be almost a sundown town. And if you don't know what that means, it means that if you were Black in that neighborhood at sundown, you were in danger. That's a really important thing to know about the history of the land that we're on. Like, learn that story, because it influences what happens in your community.
So there's that important space. There's the important space of befriending in the pain, so to speak, the genuine coming alongside space of relationship building, that it's ultimately about our relationship building. But I'm also feeling like this need also of this lament and repent space as well as part of the practice. Yeah. And not the white fragility space of like, oh, I'm so sorry, oh no, not that, right? We're not, right. We're talking about the genuine repentance, the what brings God to tears, should bring us to tears, and acknowledging it in our own personal histories in life. And then an importance around for.
I want to add one thing to that, and that is one of the ways to even understand what you're repenting of is to spend time listening to folks who are of the cultures that have been injured in the process of colonialism. So whether that's, if you're a social media person at all, follow Indigenous writers, follow African theologians, follow folks like that, because they will tell you what grieves them, and then you can learn something from them.
Yeah. And then the last thing I heard you kind of saying in your own space has been finding your own place of contemplative space, kind of what we talked about last week. Where's your space of kind of meditative centering, contemplative centering, whether it's, you know, in nature or in practice, but that rooting space for you that I guess is also uncolonized. how do we develop that like uncolonized space of being, maybe is what I'm, with God, just present with God.
Right. That's a mindset that we Westerners have a hard time embracing. Is just existing. But I have a space down by the river here in Pittsburgh that there's a bench I sit on, and I just sit. I go and have a sit with God there. You know, that's kind of my place for not performing. That's my place for not being the leader. It's the closest I get to nature, to be honest. I think one of the other handles is reignite or reconnect your relationship to nature. I think because nature is, the earth is one of the we've been divorced from the earth through the process of colonization, and so I'm really bad at that. So I'm the descendant, and Carlos, I'm going to answer your question here, because I would say I'm a descendant of enslaved people, which it implies once free but then enslaved. I'm a descendant of agrarian people, right, who even in their enslavement were agrarian people, but I have no connection to the earth at all. And I'm seeking to try to make that connection. I'm also a person who's not going out into the woods. Okay, like just stop. Right? One of my mentors said, you know what, Leeann, you could plant a flower, plant a plant, and just work at keeping it alive. You know, and so I did, and it died. I learned a lot about rhythms that the rhythms that kept me busy to the point where I couldn't even keep a plant alive. I learned a lot about the fact that I didn't really care that the plant stayed alive, and relating to the earth in harmony really is a different mindset than what I have ever been formed with.
And I'll say just personally, one more thing in this whole space of what's been helpful for me is just, if you can, in your journey of life, develop some true soul friends that you can be vulnerable with about these type of things. Personally, like my relationship with you and Wayne, and our relationship as families, is just deeply impacted who I am as a human being. And that's just from our decades of being in a journey of life together, and like developing deep soul friendships, which is not an easy space. That's
you're
like
not going to check it off on your list, right? Like it's slow, the slow work of the gospel, you know.
So I have one last question for you, and then we'll open it up, see if others have some question as well. But one last question. So ultimately, I'm trying to find space here where we're caring for ourselves in order to care for others. How do you think this whole conversation helps us do that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Number one, we're created for relationship, right? And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about getting rooted in relationship. I think resisting a Western mindset that's really hard for Westerners, because then we give ourselves credit for resisting a Western mindset. We're like, I'm resisting, look at how good I am at resisting, right? Yeah. But there is an invitation to healing in this, right? I think that's what this is. This is an invitation to healing what has been broken, even an invitation to connect to nature, is an invitation to healing. We don't really know how poisoned we've been by this colonizer mindset, because we are so far away from the precipitating events that it just seems normal. Like everything seems like this is just the way it is. And so for a lot of us, we don't know how to just be. We don't know when this is creeping up. And so I want to get to Deborah's question here, because I think it's really important. And maybe this is a good way to sort of end, which is that this isn't really about, this too is about grace. This is an invitation. So if the question is, how do we care for ourselves? This is an invitation to freedom. This is an invitation to healing. Is it actually possible for white people to just be? I don't know the answer to that, but I'll tell you what my friend Lenore said to me when I was quizzing her about the same thing. I was like, Lenore, you're talking about land acknowledgements, and what about all those people who just do it to perform? Like, shouldn't they stop, you know? And she said, Leeann, not all of our relatives are going to do everything right all the time. And that was that was the word I needed to hear. It was like, give people the honor of trying and journey with them in relationship. And so, yeah, it can be really hard for white folks to not establish white supremacy, right? And yet, this is the journey we're on. Not everybody's going to do it right, but we all are invited to keep moving towards healing.
Yes, thank you, Leeann. That's a good and a helpful word.
I gave Molly 2 books that I want to just recommend.
Okay.
For folks to pick up, or you to send out later.
Awesome. Yeah.
Randy Woodley is just like a hero, an indigenous theologian who is doing some very serious things. And he really talks about evangelism and ministry as healing. This is the work that we're doing. So I don't know if she'll pass them on to you later.
You can drop. Can you drop them in the chat, Molly? And if anybody else at this point has a question or a reflection that you want us to chat about, we'd be glad to hear from you now. And I'll also send out that information, that link tomorrow in the email that I'll send out with a link to this recording as well.
Jeff?
Anybody have anything else for us? Yes, Therese?
This is Therese, yes.
Yes, go ahead.
In terms of books, with the things we're talking about now, I wanted to recommend particularly to people of color, My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that exactly right. But anyway, yes, so that would be a great book. One of my responses as I was listening to Leeann, and I think the question was something about what do decolonized people do, or what do oppressed people do to decolonize their minds? And the first thing that came to me is that they need to be more understanding of their own trauma. Because, like, for example, assimilation into the culture and defending it, saying, you know, I'm able to be successful or received because I have assimilated, is a type of trauma response, which is friending. So if we were aware that the things that we're doing sometimes that we think make us comfortable and more acceptable, which in reality really do not, then we would be able to decolonize our minds more.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Therese. I love that book. And absolutely, this is about everybody being gentle and easy with themselves, doing the hard work, but not damning yourself. And I can speak as a person who's had my own, journey, or is having my own journey of decolonization. There's a lot of grief when you wake up. There's a lot of grief.
I just want to say I'm nodding at you, Leeann, Right now I'm in my bed clothes, so I don't want to show you. But I am nodding.
Thanks, Therese. Any other questions?
Carlos had his hand raised.
Oh, yes. Go ahead, Carlos.
Jeff, I want to thank you, Ms. Leeann, and also Ms. Therese for that. In hearing your lecture, it resonates with me. My son took a genetic test, and it was determined that like half of it was European and half was Native American, which I totally understand because Mexico and Latin America was colonized by the Spaniards and the French and the Europeans. And it's quite a shock when you look at it historically and you think that you are a product of a European father and your mother was raped. And so you're the product of that conception. There's no, that kind of thing. So waking up to that kind of trauma and what you do with the anger, and Therese, what you said is become aware of your own trauma instead of denying it and say, you know what, this is how I as a person came about. Nevertheless, the love of God is there for me too. And in listening to you, for me, I think the scripture was used to also enforce this because for me, as I came to an awareness, I realized that I was taught scripture starting with Genesis 3, and the concept of original sin was banged into me. Carlos, you're not worthy. You're nothing but a worm, and you should be grateful that God loves you. Until the day came when I said, well, wait a minute, time out. Why don't we start with Genesis 1 and 2, where God declares all of us very good. And getting a hold of that and coming up with my own language, defining myself as God defines me, instead of defining myself as a conquered people. I like to go back to Genesis 1 and says, you know what, I really am a free person. Before the Europeans came here, the Aztecs and all those Native American Indians were a free nation. And so I think tapping into the beginning, back to Genesis 1, is transformational. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hey, there is one thing I meant to say, but forgot to. And it's for white folks, especially white-bodied folks. Get in touch with the fact that you're not white. Okay, like part of the healing is being able to say, well, for folks who are descendants of the colonized, at times, as Carlos said, we have to deal with the grief of what those stories mean. We all have to deal with the grief and trauma of our ancestral lines, right? But one thing that white-bodied folks don't really do is get ethnic at all. And I think part of healing is breaking that down, in part because in your ethnic stories, there are traumas that will actually probably create some solidarity with those of us who are descendants of the colonized.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Carlos, because that was an important theological shift for me too, to understand my belovedness is what's first, all of our belovedness. And I truly believe, like, entering into that more kind of contemplative spirituality, the meditative space, helps us see that there's a unit of awareness, that all things belong and all things are connected, and that we all start from the place of the beloved. And if we're starting there together, it makes all the difference than starting from, frankly, a theological hierarchy of sinner and not sinner, or who sinned the most, or who's doing, and where are you falling in that, and how much do you need to repent of this, that, or the other thing. When the truth is, there's nothing we do that earns God's love for us, and there's nothing we do that will withhold God's love from us. And I appreciated, Leeann, us kind of landing in the end in a place of grace, where you talked about grace, which even for me just helped. It was just like, oh yeah, I can breathe. Like, we can breathe here together. We can be in this space together because grace is present with us. Question around a resource. Can someone recommend a resource about getting in touch with not being white? Genealogically, I'm thoroughly Western European, but whiteness as a construct is also a thing.
I'm gonna have to think about that. But actually, you know what? I would pick up Resmaa Menakem's book because it's got exercises for Black bodies and white bodies, and he has a particular focus on beliefs as well. But I think that I would start there. I think there are some other books, but I can't. Whiteness is erasure. So I would if you start there, I would say maybe focusing on whiteness isn't the thing. Focus on your thoroughly Western European history. Like, what do you know about your people? Who are your people?
We know quite a bit, actually. Some folks and my relatives have done like genealogy all the way back. And I've been like in this weird place of yearning to find that, every white American says, oh, I'm 1/4 Cherokee, or, something like weird like that. And I'm sort of like, show me something. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe in the Welsh 1100s, maybe there's something there, like, it's really like, I feel very Western European when I look at my genealogy. So I'm trying to think about that in terms of whiteness as a construct, and thinking,
whiteness as a construct is erasure.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying, and maybe I didn't say it clearly. When I say get in touch with the fact that there's more to you than being white, you are white bodied. That is just the way it is, right? And there are issues that come, privileges for you to think about how you might resist those things. Right. But when I talk about not being white, it's about not having that erasing construct, not having that construct erase your ethnic identity, and therefore also erasing the value of all the other identities. Like, we have to understand that whiteness was created in opposition to Blackness. Like, it was just to say, oh, I'm not them. I'm not low on the totem pole, or low on the social ladder like they are. And so, yeah, I think this is more about healing than reading. I think it's more about breathing and feeling. And but I will think about that question about a book. I would direct you to Resmaa's book to start.
Whiteness is a construct. I mean, is it the podcast Seeing White that does such a great job of talking about that?
That's great.
And it just really helps you get to what you just said, Leeann, why they came up with the idea of why we needed whiteness. Oh, because we're going to be different from you, and we're going to elevate ourselves above you. And I think it's called Seeing White, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's just Seeing White, yeah.
It's the podcast series is called Seen on Radio, SCENE on radio. Yes. And the series is called Seeing White.
There it is. Any last word or question? Any other hands up, Molly? I don't see any other hands up.
Don't see any. Let me just check the next screen of squares. No, not seeing any.
Well, thanks, Leeann.
Yeah, thank you. I love talking to you. So thanks to all the friends who joined and decided just to hear us talk.
Yeah, I appreciate you. I'm grateful for everybody listening in, and hope this was helpful. And just invite God's peace and blessings on you all as you go into the rest of your night. So peace be with you, friends.